In this podcast series, we're trying to give a voice to all involved in health research and get an insight from different perspectives, sectors, and roles. So some would argue that doing a PhD is a completely different beast to doing research as part of a wider research team. We've been approached by PhD students and we've been asked to do a podcast specifically about the PhD experience. So we're here together with Catherine Davidson today, who will be telling us all about her experience of applying an equity lens and doing a PhD and how that was for her. And I should start by saying she's just successfully passed her Viva. So very welcome and congratulations, Catherine.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So what was your PhD in?
So my PhD has been all about exploring how people experience their body image after they've had a stroke. So body image is this really kind of broad concept, but it's defined as how people think, feel, perceive and behave in relation to how their body works, its capabilities and how it looks.
And how did you go about it?
So for my PhD, I did a review of all the existing evidence that's in this topic area. I then interviewed people with stroke and then had some discussions with clinical experts to kind of go through all of my results. So as part of exploring body image as a whole after stroke, I also looked at how body image experience could impact on people's well-being and recovery. And that's really important because more and more people are having strokes and thankfully more people are surviving. That makes it so important to make sure that we're giving them the best care possible. My work basically starts to build the evidence base, which shows that body image is important after stroke. It can impact on well-being and recovery. And I've been able to make initial recommendations for future research, which includes looking at how people who are struggling with body image might be able to be supported after stroke and how we could measure any benefits of support. And I've also been able to create sort of a stroke-specific definition of body image that needs further work in the future as well. So that's my PhD in a nutshell.
In a nutshell, that already sounds like a massive project.
Thank you.
And how does stroke change the way we view our bodies? Can you tell us a bit more about that?
So what I've been able to kind of gauge from my results is that, well, basically stroke can impact people in such a wide variety of different ways. That includes physically, so the body might work or look different. They might feel differently emotionally or psychologically or even cognitively, so the way their brain works. And all these changes altogether can just change how people view themselves and think about themselves, and that includes their body image. For example, people might look in the mirror and see see something different in their face, and that really impacts that they might not want to go out, or they might think they walk a bit differently and feel a bit going to be judged when they go outside. And they're kind of examples from my work of how body image can be changed. But it does seem to be largely due to those bodily changes. And also people just want to be able to be kind of feel normal again after the stroke. And that's all part of body image is kind of regaining or trying to regain a sense of normality again after the stroke.
So it sounds like people have a certain way of viewing and understanding themselves and their bodies, and then stroke happens and it change.
Yeah, definitely. It's just so sudden, so unexpected, no preparation time, just one day, could be walking around as normal and the next day someone could have had a stroke and they've got all these changes to cope with.
Wow, that does sound very scary. And so I do know, must give this away, that you have also looked at health inequalities in relation to your study. Do you want to tell us a bit more about that? How did you go about it?
So originally, way back in the beginning, the main area for consideration in terms of inequality was just making sure that I was as inclusive as possible with the people who were going to be involved in my work, because I've mentioned how the impacts of stroke can be so wide-ranging, and this includes different severities of impacts. And the one that just comes to mind straight away is people who have communication difficulties. because often they might not be included in research because of difficulties around, communicating during interviews or whatever, with people. So the first thing I did was to make sure that I had kind of information sheets and consent forms that could be used for people with those communication changes, and also a witness to consent procedure for people who weren't able to write the name, for example. So right from the beginning was making sure I had those materials ready. And also in my interviews, for example, it wasn't just, we'll have a conversational interview. I also opened it up and said, if you have any other ways that you might like to communicate with me, so photos or drawing or whatever it might be, to try and really encourage people who might otherwise not be involved to be able to be involved in this work. And that's one that really comes to mind right from the very beginning.
Right, yes. It's really important to give everyone a voice in research, including those that are sometimes referred to as seldom heard voices. Is there a difference between different social groups?
That is definitely a topic for future research, because in my sample, people that I interviewed, I tried to get a varied sample. I did initially think about trying to kind of aggregate my data, so look at my data for different groups of people, so different genders, different ethnic backgrounds, but in the end I didn't do that. There wasn't kind of enough pattern in my data to warrant doing that, but future research definitely could tap into that to explore that, because it is my gut feeling that across different ethnic backgrounds, across different age groups, there will be differences. And I think as part of the health inequity side, I think it's really important to better understand those in more detail to be able to address those inequities as well.
And is there any evidence suggesting that that might be the case?
It's a tricky area, actually, because there's lots of different, I could talk for hours about body image and society and everything, but there's so much varied evidence, right? So a lot of work will say it's mostly women, it's mostly, females who have body image problems. But actually, when you go away and look at the work that's been done, most of the work has been done with women. So actually, it likely is a problem with men as well, but they're just not as well researched as such. And male body image is kind of becoming more frequent. And the findings are saying, yeah, men have body image difficulties too. It's just different across the genders. So for women, it's typically like, do you want to look like a model or an Instagram model or whatever? And for men, it's typically like muscularity and that type of thing. So in general society, we know there's that difference to begin with anyway. And then, yeah, definitely across different cultures, there's different cultural standards, and that all plays into how people perceive their body image and how they want their body image to be. Very much seems to depend on the culture they were brought up in. So the likelihood is that if we were to delve further into body image and stroke and explore it across those different groups, we would get some more detailed findings about the impacts of those factors.
And so, as some PhD students might be hearing, but also researchers generally, actually, what is it that helped you, go through the process of applying an equity lens to your work?
I was fortunate enough to join the ARC. Well, it was towards the end of my PhD, so about 2.5 years in when I joined. And that was when I became introduced to the HIAT.
We should say HIAT is the Health Inequalities Assessment Toolkit, and it's focused on helping researchers ask the right questions when they're trying to do research with a health equity lens.
Yeah, sorry, I jumped in with that, didn't I, with the HIAT? So when I joined the ARC, that was when I became introduced to the HIAT. So before the HIAT, I guess my focus on the inequities, it was mostly around the stroke side of things, because I've had a really supportive supervisory team, are very expert in the stroke topic area, and that's probably our main focus was the stroke side of it, and really making sure that people who are often underrepresented could be involved in my work. So then when I started using the HIAT and the toolkit, that was when I started to really think more deeply about inequities as a whole, and also started to really realise actually how complex those inequities are. So I've mentioned stroke severity, different impacts of stroke could lead to different disabilities as well. But it really, really got me thinking about the cross-cutting inequities. So I think that's the right term. So it wasn't just a case of women in society or women after stroke, it would be women from a certain cultural background. It was the importance of the complexity basically around that. It was after I started using the HIAT when I started to think about that, and predominantly was using that as kind of a reflective tool as well, to kind of look back over the work that I've done and think about what I could have done differently and what I could do at that point going forward to address some of the questions that the HIAT tool asked about in the prompts.
It sounds like you're seeing a value in implementing an equity lens to health research.
No, I definitely am. And I think using the HIAT as well, I've mentioned how it was kind of a reflective tool. That's how I used it. It also helped me to write, for example, a section of my discussion when I was looking back on my sample and talking about who was in my sample, the types of people who were involved in my research, and also to think about going forward what work needs to be done. And also when I was writing up my thesis, I think it was in my introduction section that I actually added a section in there about global health inequalities and stroke care around the world. So it was kind of those prompts that got me thinking and just opened my eyes as a researcher as opposed to the importance of addressing those inequalities.
So speaking of global inequalities, is there a difference between body image after stroke in the UK versus other countries?
So body image, I'm not so sure about that one in terms of stroke. I just don't think the research has been done to be able to compare it globally yet. But certainly in terms of stroke care, different countries have different kind of quality of care. And that's what I was able to add in, was to look at how that care quality is rated around the world.
Is body image always taken into consideration in care offered around the world?
No, it's so through my work, I've been able to kind of provide that initial evidence to say it looks like it's a problem for some people and it's something that needs attention and we should perhaps be looking at this. But it is very, very early stages of building up that evidence base to show it needs addressing. So it would be through future research, so larger studies, more interviews, honing the findings, honing the recommendations across different groups. And that would be how I would anticipate being able to impact in the future on clinical guidelines.
On a practical note, because you said that you've been using the HIAT. The HIAT is part of the Focus on Research and Equity web resource. Did you use other parts of the web resource?
Yeah, so what I did is I used the HIAT. I filled that out initially, and then I went to the web tool and I went through each section and I read each section and really made sure that the notes I'd made in the HIAT linked through to and reflected the online tool. So I used them kind of hand in hand almost, like I did like an initial sweep through using the HIAT tool and then went through and did some more detail with the online stuff.
Not everyone listening to this is an academic, but bearing in mind that some are current PhDs, aspiring PhDs, or maybe just supervisors of PhD students. Are there any things that you wish you knew sooner that we can offer maybe as tips, or things that you found important or particularly helpful that maybe supervisors need to keep in mind?
I was thinking about this, and I think if I was to go back and kind of do my PhD again, I would have that HIAT right from the beginning. I know I've spoken a lot about the HIAT, but I do really rate it because it did really help me as a tool, even just as a reflection tool. It was helpful. So I think to have it from the beginning, to be able to use that throughout, would be really useful, because when you get to a point where you've kind of got your research ideas, you might have started putting together your protocol for students, you might have spoken to the supervisors about their ideas, and then going through the HIAT and making sure that the questions, the design, links into those inequalities. And also one thing that I think would be really important as well is thinking about public advisor input and especially feedback around inequalities there, and also dissemination and having that inequality lens on dissemination. Because one question that I know stumped me a little bit when I was going through the form was the question about how can you make sure that when you kind of disseminate the findings that you're not going to make those inequalities bigger. And that was a question I thought, wow, I'd not given a lot of thought to that. I didn't, not it hadn't crossed my mind, but it's not something that you typically think of, because I think in research a lot of the time you think, right, we'll do conferences, we'll write these articles and we'll put it, peer-reviewed journal. But actually I thought, wow, that's so true. It's so important to think about, okay, you've got your findings, but how are you going to distribute those findings to reach all those different groups of people and not just other academics? Or if I was to do it again, I would use the HIAT throughout my research design and my protocol, but especially in that dissemination plan, I think, as well, would be really important.
As you say, the HIAT is meant to be used from the very beginning and help teams discuss their protocol planning, as they do anyway, but in a more equity-sensitive way. But in discussions I often have with PhD students, one of the challenges they raise is that kind of single self-responsibility for the HIAT and how that can fit in with academic supervision and any public involvement they have in their studies. Any thoughts on or preferences about self versus teamwork and the HIAT specifically within the PhD parameters?
I think a mixture. I think it would be a case of being mindful of the questions generally. So when you're thinking about your work and going through the protocol and kind of putting those ideas together, and then when it comes to discussing the protocol with supervisors, maybe having that HIAT form there every now and again and just bringing that up. And also, I didn't get to use my HIAT form with any public advisors, but I did speak to one of my public advisors, and she gave me some great feedback around dissemination and how to reach different communities. And I thought, wow, I was able to get that just from a conversation about my findings. So imagine what someone would be able to get from a public advisor with the discussion around the HIAT. I think you'd be able to get so much really important insight from that as well. So I think a mixture, really.
We've been talking about it for a while, but I don't think I've asked. So did you have any previous training, understanding of health inequalities generally? And then was it based on that, according to your level of understanding of that, to use the HIAT on your own, or did you have any training for that?
So I didn't have any specific training around the HIAT. I think when I first got involved with the ARC, I was able to go to the training day, and there was a session around the HIAT form. And by that point, I think I'd already had a look at it, so I was kind of aware of it. So it was kind of nice to get a little refresher almost of using the HIAT form, but I'd had no training as such. Because I had a look at it and I went through it to try and absorb it and think about what the questions and how I might answer them. And that was when I spoke to my supervisor, my main supervisor, about those questions, and we kind of went through it together. And then I came away, put some more detail in there, and kind of worked through it iteratively. I'd say it was okay. It was okay on my own, and it was, the online stuff was useful. But I think it would be really useful to have been able to get some additional training around that as well. A dedicated sort of HIAT session. There might already be one out there that I just didn't know about all the time, but perhaps something like that would be really, really useful. And I think one thing that's helped me too is just talking about it with people, just having the chance to be able to talk through ideas, and because people can just bring new things that you've not thought of to a table, and that's been massively helpful. So I think just having that chance, even the chance to specifically talk about the HIAT with other students, for example, that would be really useful, bringing those different ideas together.
Catherine, what's next for you?
What's next? So at the moment, I'm still working through my corrections for my PhD. That's ongoing there. But my plan is to apply for the NIHR Development and Skills Enhancement Award. I'd love to be able to learn some more about clinical trials and thinking more about larger scale research. And I'm also continuing my work on the stroke research team. So I'm involved with a few different research projects on different topics. So I'm just enjoying learning more about different aspects of stroke research and different research methods at different stages. So yeah, that's kind of what's next and what's ongoing at the moment.
And is there a next step plan for the PhD project?
I would love to take it forward by means of, so I mentioned I had a stroke-specific definition of body image that I'd been able to create from the interviews. If I could pick anything to do next, I would take that definition, I would take it to different groups of people. So people from different ethnic backgrounds, I go to different communities, and also people with different stroke impacts, different severities, take it to them and say, what do you think of this? How do I need to change it to make it so it means something to you? And just really hone that definition to try and make it something that as many people as possible could resonate with, to make it as useful as possible.
Well, good luck with that, with future applications and all your endeavours. Thank you very much for joining us today and giving us the perspective of a PhD student that's just completed.
Thank you. Thanks, Katerina.
PhD students out there, was that helpful? What are the challenges you face with equity-sensitive health research? Let us know using #ImplementEquity so we can all together explore how these can be addressed.